Hey, this is Ian again. We're going to be doing chapter 4 of Reluctant Regent today, which is meeting the sheepish, which is where we get into the local culture, such as it is there. But before I did that, I kind of wanted to go back to what I was a little something that I was talking about in the previous chapter, and that was when we were talking about the how the signet ring didn't really seem to have too much impact on people, and how a lot of times I think we as people tend to give too much weight to symbols without really considering that sort of uh, why we give weight to the symbols, which usually ends up being some sort of implied violence behind it. Um, and I think probably the best example of that is the legal system. I think, and don't get me wrong, I think legal laws, these are good. These are signs of healthy civilizations, but I think a lot of times when we talk about the legal system and how much we respect it, we just kind of assume that people are going to respect the legal system, but and mostly people do, but really what's underlying that respect is just the sort of the threat of punishment if you don't respect it. And and I think people realize that that's not particularly um, earth-shaking revelation. Hopefully it isn't. If you break the law and you get caught, theoretically, of course, you would have some sort of punishment. Um, but I think when we think about the legal system, it actually is designed and came about as a way of kind of separating us from that old sort of primitive tribal feud system of justice, which is where somebody wrongs you, you take it out on them or you take it out on their family, and then you get these endless cycles of violence, which you can see in a lot of the the sort of uh, tribal societies that still exist in some areas like New Guinea and I don't know, maybe even the Amazon. Well, hell, you could even see it in the theoretically. I guess if you want to go back far enough to the chimpanzee uh, bands that people the anthropologists have been studying for generations at this point. But that endless series of violence. I mean, it ends up being actually. I think somebody was saying that the casualty rate, especially in some of these New Guinea tribes, where they just kind of endlessly feud with each other, is just insane. Something I don't know. I'm just going to pull some percentage out of my ass here. That's like 60% casualties amongst the male population. I know it's not that, but I mean it's pretty crazy when you look over time just how that kind of endless grinding conflict goes on. And you can see that even with in the United States with like kind of modern gang conflicts. Even in the city where I live, there's gangs that are constantly in low level fighting, and there's like one or two people that die, um, uh, you know, a couple of years, and it just adds up, percentage wise. And the whole legal system is kind of designed, I think, to at least in my opinion, to kind of get us away from that. Where yeah, we're going to move this violence, remove ourselves from the violence a little bit by just putting some sort of entity, whether it's a king or some sort of bureaucracy or legal bureaucracy in the way of it. And I think when we think of the legal system and why we respect it and should respect it, I think we need to keep it in our head that there's that kind of implicit threat, that ongoing violence behind it that sort of underlies the reason it's there and our legal system itself. Um, okay, well, enough off on a tangent here. Like I said, I was going to go into chapter 4 today, so let me go ahead and read that, and I'll share it from the screen as per usual. This is meeting the sheepish, which is the locals that live in Sheepland, and in the town of Lamb's Rebuke, which I honestly don't know where I came up with that, folks. I think you can kind of figure out what that means on your own because I certainly don't have any idea. Okay, so meeting the sheepish. And remember in the previous chapter, they'd actually got the garrison sorted out. So here we go. Meeting the sheepish, chapter 4 of Reluctant Regent. After Kells had so efficiently streamlined the transition process, I decided to gather the garrison together for a chat. This was easy enough to do since they were conveniently clustered around Darren's corpse, staring in confusion at their former leader. I decided that given the awkward circumstances that we found ourselves in, a stirring speech was called for, both to boost morale and, clarify expectations. Gather round, lads and lasses, I shouted. So, if you haven't heard, I'm Lord Caldor, and I'm taking command of the garrison and the entire province of Sheepland. I waited as they shuffled together into a roughly linear blob-like formation, warily eyeing Minrir as he stared expressionlessly at them. They were a sorry-looking lot, about 30-odd ruffians clad in scruffy leathers, wielding a wide assortment of rusty weapons, including one particularly disreputable lad with what looked like a two-headed garden rake. You heard Lord Caldor. Line up, Minrir roared, and with much cursing and accidental jabbing, the soldiers shuffled into a rough approximation of a line. Actually, it was more like a jagged curve, but I gave them credit for trying, and it was marginally better than their original blob configuration. I stood in front of them, my hands clasped behind my back, and looked over my first command. I apologize, I began, for the circumstances of my arrival. Not a problem, sir. Glad to have you, sir. Glad to have someone of your quality finally here. Oh, happy day, happy day. The garrison all eagerly talked over each other, babbling about how delighted they were to finally meet me. Of course, the nervous glances they kept shooting Minrir's way might have had something to do with their newfound enthusiasm, but it was at least a start. Yes, well, thank you, I continued, clearing my throat. I would like to apologize for our initial transition difficulties, and I assure you that I have no intention of making a habit of dropping people off of walls. I looked sternly at Kells, and she looked back, the very picture of innocence. Now, Mr. Darren and I could not communicate effectively, and I share some of the blame for that. No, sir. No, sir. He was a demon, he was. A right cad. Never liked the man. Never liked him. Darren, he wasn't right in his head. He just wasn't right at all. Right, I said, frowning at the constant interruptions. So, then, we have a lot of work to do. Starting with getting some gates for the gatehouse, which I know we are sorely lacking. Well, by the divines, you're right, sir. The gatehouse doesn't have any gates on them. I always thought that was a bit odd myself. Oh, good eye, sir, good eye. Oh, you're so on it. We can't have a gatehouse with no gates now, can we? Okay, then. And, as we're going to need to clean up the place, this is the northernmost fortress of the formerly great house Caldor, or is it a midden heap? I can't really tell right now. We'll need to tidy up a bit, sharpen those weapons, and start practicing. Only then can we uphold the honor of House Caldor and protect our economically valuable citizen. Oh, yes, sir, love me some polishing, love it, I do. It's a right mess here, sir, you's right about that. Caldor, 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 they began chanting, brandishing their various rusty weapons and one double-edged rake, while Kells clapped delightedly behind them. They're just so cute, she cried, and so enthusiastic. I just love them so much. Kell's commentary increased their fervor and terror so much that their brandishing and slogan shouting got to the point where I was worried they'd start hurting each other. So I raised my hands, and they slowly quieted. Okay, troops, I said, enough of that. Let's get to work. We've got a lot to do. And with that, the ragged formation broke up, and the garrison began the long and arduous process of turning itself into an actual garrison capable of garrisoning things that needed garrisoning. The rest of the day went by fairly quickly, with Minrir organizing teams to unhitch and unload the wagon and to start the process of cleaning up the place. Kells found the gatehouse gates under a pile of discarded ale jugs. So that's where they got to, one of the garrison said, and soon had the stout oaken doors mounted with the terrified and thus enthusiastic help of a few of the soldiers. Now, we had some issues, of course. This tends to happen whenever you get groups of humans who are a disagreeable and quarrelsome bunch at the best of times, whenever you get groups of humans working together towards a common goal. The first hiccup was when I looked up from unpacking a crate of books to see Kells choking Barstow. "Kells, you unhand that soldier this instant," I shouted. "You are not to choke the garrison unless I explicitly give you permission to do so. Is that understood?" Kells reluctantly let him go, then apologetically brushed the dirt off of his jerkin. "Now, what seems to be the problem?" It turned out to be a relatively minor issue. He had not wholeheartedly agreed with her that this was, quote, "a good day to have a good day," and instead he had replied that it was just a, quote, "tolerably good day, what with all the falling off of walls and such," end quote. Now, this led to a disagreement, which then led to the choking. But once I clarified to Chels that she couldn't just murder people for not being cheerful enough, things got a bit better. I did, however, notice that everyone became exceedingly agreeable after this incident, particularly when she was around. The second unfortunate incident occurred when we misplaced Darren's corpse. We had initially left him lying on the courtyard looking like a sad, mushed sack of potatoes while we unpacked and polished things. And by the time I thought to bury him so he wouldn't stink up the place, he had vanished without a trace. We searched high and low, but we never did find him, although Moose let out a self-satisfied belch at one point that made me highly suspicious. He seemed in an inordinately good mood and began playfully biting the garrison as they went about their duties until I was forced to take him aside. "Moose, you are not to eat the soldiery," I hissed, "even if they're already dead. Again, you're supposed to be an herbivore for the divine sake. What's wrong with you? Go eat grass or something." Moose just looked at me amusedly with those reddish goat eyes of his and gave another foul-smelling belch. Then he wandered off, and everybody gave him wide berth from then on out. But despite these issues, the garrison worked hard over the next few weeks to get the fortress in order. The towers and stables were swept out, repaired, and cleaned, and armor and weapons were mended and polished to Minrir's satisfaction. He began drilling the soldiers relentlessly, and soon the small garrison began to seem like they actually might be able to hold the fortress against an attack. Well, that is, as long as the attackers weren't too numerous. Or actually, if the attackers weren't that motivated either, or trained. Okay, I'll admit it, we weren't working with the cream of the kingdom soldier here, so the quality of our troops was hampered somewhat by their innate physical and moral, if I'm being totally honest, deficiencies. Kells, on the other hand, decided to clean up the garden, and soon she had a small squad waging war against the weeds which had overtaken it. Planted beans, corn, and a wide assortment of flowers, and soon the courtyard was actually a pleasant place to sit, at least when it wasn't full of sweating, swearing guardsmen doing weapons drills. Minrir took over the cooking, and even got a small group of like-minded soldiers together to create simple yet tasty meals, while I went about inventorying the supplies I found stockpiled in the tower basement, and pretty much ensuring that everything ran relatively smoothly. I cleaned out a room on the top level of the tower for my quarters and added my collection of books to the well-stocked garrison library, which was just beneath it. I even found time to practice with my crossbow and soon became quite proficient with it. All in all, I was most pleased with how things were going, to the point that I began considering my larger responsibilities to Lamb's Rebuke and the rest of the province. Now, I noticed as we were cleaning up the fortress that there was a distinct lack of interest in the town by the garrison, and vice versa, which struck me as a bit odd. When I asked Barstow about it, he simply shrugged and muttered something about how the Sheepish were an unsavory lot, and then went back to industriously weeding the garden under Kels's watchful eye. So, after some thought, I decided I should go do my due diligence and get down to Lamb's Rebuke to see how things were going. I initially wanted to ride Moose, but after one look at him, I decided against it. Regardless of how unsavory the locals were, I doubted they'd appreciate being approached by an omnivorous, demon-possessed horse. So early the next morning, I told Minra and Kells to watch over the garrison, and then I walked into town to introduce myself. The weather was nice, just a chill drizzle rather than the icy rain I was accustomed to at this point. And after a short time, I entered the town and approached a lad who was industriously repairing a split rail fence. Well met, youth, I said heartily. So I wonder if you could point me to the leader of your fine community. He looked at me in confusion for a moment. Why wouldn't I be able to point you to our leader? He asked. The town isn't that big. Paused. The lad was obviously smart for a sheepish. Quite right. Quite right. Let me rephrase. Where is your mayor? Well, why didn't he just say that the first time? He said peevishly. I have to finish up working on this fence and then repair the roof, which needs to be done by lunch so I can herd our sheep into the lower pastures. Then my friends and I are going to repave the lane by the harbor, which is high time we did, and I'd like to repaint the doors before going to bed. I don't have time to waste chatting with strangers. He pointed at the large tavern down by the bay. Thera is the closest thing we have to a leader, since most of us are too busy to bother with meetings and such. You'll find her in there. My thanks, young youth, I said. I'll be on my way. I paused for a moment. Here was one of my subjects, diligently working away on a drizzly day for the betterment of his community. This was the strength of House Caldor, not the semi-trained garrison up at the fort, or the epic battles and court intrigues that I had read about in our histories. A lad rebuilding a fence, herding sheep, and painting doors. This was the foundation on which our entire civilization rested. It quite brought a tear to my eye. You're doing a good job, youth, I told him, my voice choked with emotion. A good job indeed. He glanced at me with annoyance, then muttered something about lazy idiots and studiously ignored me as he continued working on the fence. I waited for a moment, then, feeling a bit put out, I left him to it and continued on to the inn. Pushing open the swinging doors, I came into one of the cleanest, best organized common rooms I'd ever seen. And that's including the one that we met Kells in, by the way. There was a large pot of something delicious smelling bubbling away in the fireplace, and a stout, beefy woman with steel gray hair in a no-nonsense bun stood behind the bar, vigorously scrubbing a large cast iron skillet. Good day, I said cheerily. Would you be Thera by chance? She looked at me incuriously and continued scrubbing. I am. Well, it's good to finally meet you. I am Matthias, Lord of House Caldor, and I've come to take over the administration of the province of Sheepland. She stared at me expressionlessly for a moment, then shrugged. Congratulations? Is that the proper response? What do you want? I'm busy. Oh, well, I'm sorry to interrupt then, I said, momentarily at a loss as to how to proceed. I had always assumed that the common folk, particularly backwoods types like the Sheepish, would be overjoyed to meet someone who grew up closer to the center of civilization. But clearly I was mistaken. Well, I suppose I just need to know how things are going, and if there's anything I can do to, make things easier for you and the other common folks. Something administrative like, perhaps? I waved vaguely around the room, although I was hard-pressed to see anything on the premises that needed administering. She gave me a considering look, her gaze traveling from my scuffed leather boots to my ink-stained hands to my hopelessly wrinkled cloak. She quickly and rather obviously reached the conclusion that I would be of limited utility. Thank you for offering, she said politely, but we're fine. Nothing really needs administering hereabouts. Oh, I said disappointedly. Well, how about the garrison then? Have they been patrolling and such, keeping raiders away? Thera looked at me like I was an idiot, and in retrospect I was. Given how I had found the garrison when I'd arrived, I felt it much more likely that they'd drawn up procedures about patrolling than actually doing so. But, I had to ask. We don't associate much with the garrison, she said tersely. And to be honest, I can hardly understand what they're saying half the time. And when I do, they're always going on about needing someone to take minutes for their meetings or some such nonsense. None of us really have any time for them. Yeah, I'd noticed a distinct lack of interest in you from the soldiers, and I suppose it would make sense that you would reciprocate. But I can assure you that I have made changes at the fortress, and we will begin patrolling regularly as soon as I can get them to walk a league in their armor without collapsing. Regularly. You have my word. Good for you, she said, clearly unimpressed. I'm sure we feel much safer already. I grinned at her for a moment. Then, with a vague sense of disappointment because there was nothing to administer, I turned to go. But as I did so, Thera thought for a moment and then called out to me, just when I got to the door. Wait, I suppose there is something you can do. Claiborne and his lads will be here tomorrow for their tribute, and they always appreciated it when someone meets them on the docks. I guess it makes them feel important or whatever. So, if you'd like to do that, it would free me up to get ahead on my linens. Paused in the doorway. Wait, what? Who's this Claiborne fellow, and why are we paying tribute to him? He's a Tranny chieftain who comes by every year looking to raid and pillage and such, she replied. Sir Darren has been paying him off for years. Sir Tranny raiders come here? I yelped in alarm. Why wasn't I informed of this? I just did, Thera said crossly, studying her skillet closely for a moment, and then, with a satisfied grunt, putting it down. And then she began industriously polishing the spotlessly gleaming bar. Now I had heard of the Sir Tranny, who had. They were a group of foul-tempered northern raiders with a fondness for painting their faces in a wild variety of garish colors, and with a propensity to burn, stab, and generally humiliate, in no particular order, anyone that irritated them. I'd never heard of them being interested in sheepland, but then again, if the late Sir Darren had been paying them off, I suppose I wouldn't have. And now I had less than a day to figure out what to do before one of their chieftains arrived. This was just great. I managed to choke out a thank you to Thera and then sprinted, or rather weaselly jogged, as I wasn't in the best shape, back to the fort. Sir Tranny, I gasped to Minrir and Kells as I staggered into the courtyard. Sir Tranny? Where? Minrir said, a brief flicker of alarm flashing over his face. Quite frankly, I found the thought of the lowlander being alarmed by anything a bit terrifying. Not here right now, I said, but they'll be here tomorrow looking for their tribute. Darren has apparently been paying them off for years. Then we've got a problem, Minrir sighed as he unsheathed the reasoned response and stared at it morosely. Kells clapped her hand excitedly. Problems! Goody! Yeah, it was a little shorter chapter. Really, the only thing I want to say about this is I've noticed over time that well-run organizations actually don't seem to need that much hands-on attention from the higher ups. Something I've noticed as long as at least in departments at the libraries and other places that as long as the leader just sets a general direction and lets the people in the front lines get to it, that's a sign of an actual pretty well-run department. So if you get somebody that's having to interact on a regular daily basis with sort of basic tasks, that doesn't mean that they're a micromanager, although that tends to be the case a lot of the times. That it's not a sign of a good supervisor. But sometimes the department is so crap, such crap that leaders actually have to micromanage just to make sure that things get done and done correctly. So that's something to look for. I mean, if a leader has to be involved in the day-to-day running on a regular basis with any sort of organization, it's not a good sign. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the leader's bad. I found, like I said, I mean, if you come in there and the other frontline folk are all shit, then it might actually end up being a good place for you to work. You are competent and know your stuff. So yeah, something to keep in mind. A little snippet of wisdom from my shiny bald head. Okay, so I think I'm done here. I'm going to go ahead and log off of here and post this, and then we will get into next week, we will do the conflict with the Sertrani Raiders, which is my first really big battle scene that gets into it. And I don't know, I kind of was chuckling when I wrote it, so I hope you guys enjoy it. See you next week.